It is Friday the 13th of 2006. We're at ICAR in Fairfax, Virginia, talking to Professor Chris Mitchell, one of the co-researchers of this project, but also deemed by all and sundry one of the parents of the peace and conflict studies field. So, Professor Mitchell, I want to start by asking you just broadly, not about you, but about this project. What did you think you learned that you didn't know? And so far, what kind of experience was this in terms of learning about the field as someone who's been in it yourself for many, many years?
Okay, well, for a start, don't call me Professor Mitchell, call me Chris.
Thank you.
Okay. I think both of our idea about the project was that there's a history there which is not being recorded, and that it's an interesting history because what's happening now to a large degree is very much influenced by what happened in the previous 40 years, perhaps longer. And I wanted to get that on record, and I wanted to get on record some of the people who were my friends and colleagues over the years and who are now mostly retired, and some of them now in their 80s and 90s. And though people are beginning to write some articles and some books about them, for example, as you know, there's a book about Morton Deutsch. There's another one about John Burton, and there's one about Johan Galtung, but there are a lot of other people who contributed to this field that I didn't want the field to forget them. Mm-hmm. And so that was one of my main motivations. I mean, what I've got out of it, in many ways, is confirmation of stuff that I half knew, and it's very interesting, finding the story from their point of view, and a lot of the things that I've found, interestingly enough, sort of echo my own experience with trying to develop a new field, often in the teeth of opposition from universities. So, listening to people's struggles and troubles and efforts that somehow parallel my own experience was sort of comforting. What's sort of discomforting, of course, is seeing a lot of my old friends getting older. Of course, it's not happening to me, but they're getting older. And seeing some of them who I remember as being sort of young Turks in the field, combative, aggressive, and very, very bright and very determined to make something of this field. Mm-hmm. And they're now, some of them, their memories are going inevitably. Mm-hmm. So that's, in a strange way, it's been a kind of a sad experience for me. And that's something I didn't expect. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to return to some of the names that you've mentioned much deeper into our interview, and ask you about the history of the field in a broader sense in a question or two, but I'd like to start with you. The people that we've interviewed were mostly, as we've just heard with the death of Adam Kurl, if they're 90 today, they were born in the late teens or early 20s. If we think of the field, we also think back of, for instance, the peace movements before even the First World War. But how about you? How did you get involved in all of this?
Do you want the long story or the longer story?
The longer story and the longest story.
All right. Well, I mean, people came into this field from all sorts of different histories, with different backgrounds. And, as you know from the work that we've done, we've had people who have been economists, lawyers, etc., etc. I've been sort of thinking about what my background was and what were the things that influenced me before I came into this field. And I came up with sort of four disciplines, if you like, four things that have always influenced me. One was history, the other was education, economics and international relations. That's where I came from, intellectually speaking. And I guess if anybody were to ask me what I think of myself, I think these days I've sort of come back to where I started, which is I think I'm a historian. And a lot of the work that I've done has been an attempt to provide accurate stories about past conflicts, past events, to tell an accurate, to produce an accurate narrative, is a very modern word, and then to sort of move on to sort of, well, why did these things happen as they did? So that was a very much a formative part of my background. How I came to it, I mean, go back to the point at which I came out of the Air Force, which was the beginning of 1955. Okay, and I came out of the Air Force, and I hadn't got a clue what I wanted to do. I knew what I didn't want to do. I did not want to get a job in an office, because I'd had 2 years of working in an office, and it was a lawyer's office, so I knew I didn't want to become a lawyer. Right? It struck me as going back to that would be the most unbelievably boring life to be led. So that I knew I didn't want to do. And around about that time, the country, Britain, was desperately short of school teachers. I mean, the teachers that had actually been trained before the Second World War were now getting old and they were retiring. And so there was a desperate shortage on the supply side of teachers. And this was the mid-50s, so the huge increase in the number of kids, which happened in Britain as it happened in the United States after the Second World War. I don't know what they called it in this country, but we called it the bulge. The bulge was sort of coming through into the schools, and so the government actually was terribly short of teachers. And so they started to offer courses, 2-year courses, at what were called teacher training colleges. They weren't universities, they weren't technical colleges, they were specifically geared for turning out school teachers. So I decided that I would give this a go, and I got a place at a 2-year training college, and you did basic courses in educational theory, and you did sort of courses in how to structure a lesson and one thing and another, and then they sort of threw you into a school in South London amid all the toughs and yobbos down there. And if you survived for 2 years, then you graduated as a teacher. But the other thing that they did was that they used, if you were going into the secondary level, which is roughly speaking the equivalent to the American high school, very roughly, then you specialized in a particular subject. And I specialized in history, which I'd always enjoyed, and English. So I came out of that 2 years allegedly qualified to teach history and English. But I also, at that time, fell in love with scholarship, with learning. And so that for the next 5 years, I think, I taught in a secondary school, 7 years, actually. And I did 5 years of evening classes at London University to do a diploma in history. It was a sort of 4-year course, and you got a diploma in modern history, and modern history meant starting around about 1500 with the Renaissance and the Reformation. And I did an extra year on a course on paleography. So at the end of this, I got the sort of certificate. Around about that time, of course, the structure of the profession was changing. I'd gone into it in 1957 with a sort of 2-year teaching certificate. Very impressive looking document. In fact, it's a hell of a lot more impressive than any of my other degrees. I mean, I think there's an inverse relationship between the sort of prestige of what you get and the size of the piece of paper they give you. I can't actually remember what you got for a PhD, but it was probably a damn sight better than, looked a lot better than mine. Sorry, anyway, to go back to this. Terrorism, do you think?
That's a fighter jet, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, as I was, teaching in the secondary school just outside of London, the structure of the profession started to change, and we started to get a whole lot of people who actually had degrees, university degrees, and they were beginning to get all the plum jobs, the heads of departments and the principals in the school and one thing or another. And it sort of struck me that if I actually wanted to make a career out of being a school teacher and make my way up the ladder and finally get my own school, which is what I wanted, I would have to get a degree. And so I started to look around for possibilities of actually going back to college. And there wasn't very much. I mean, this was the beginning of the 1960s. British academic life was pretty conservative in those days, and it still is. And so there were really only three places there are only three colleges that offered places to what they call mature students. Oxford, Cambridge, London. So I applied to all three of them to go back for a 3-year degree. And Oxford and Cambridge turned me down, and London accepted me, but with a proviso. Because, of course, what I wanted to do was go back and do a degree in history. And the university authorities said, well, unfortunately, you can't do that. And I sort of said, well, why not? And they said, well, to do a degree in history, you have to have had some training in a classical language. In other words, you had to have done 4 years Latin at school, or 4 years Greek, or presumably classical Sanskrit or something like that. And I hadn't. I mean, I'd actually been given the choice, and I'd actually done Spanish because I thought that was going to be more useful to me. I hadn't got even any Latin at all. And I said, this is, I don't want to study medieval documents. I want to study early modern history, and that didn't make any difference. Obviously, to understand Bismarck's foreign policy, you had to understand Latin. So they said, oh, well, we won't let you in to do a history degree, but, we'll let you in to do an economics degree. And so I ended up going back to University College London at the beginning of 1963, I think, to do an economics degree, which is where I sort of picked up my economics. Now, the thing was that the London University economics degree was, it was a sort of strange creature because it actually wasn't just an economics degree. It was a sort of a general social science degree. You had to do economics all the way through the 3 years. And the first year you didn't get any kind of a choice at all. You did 6 basic courses. I won't bore you with what they are. But then at the end of that year, you got to make a choice. And you could specialize a little bit. Okay, if you wanted to go on doing economics, you could do economics. But if you wanted to do sociology, for example, you still did some economics for the next 2 years, but you could specialize in sociology or anthropology or psychology. You still ended up with a Bachelor of Science in Economics, but it was then with a specialization in whatever it was. So at the end of my first year, I was going to go and do the economic history specialization. That was the sort of thing that I was thinking of doing from the start. Okay, you won't let me do history, I'll do economic history, sort of thing. And then it must have been the beginning of the summer term. We were sitting in the student common room in the college talking about what we were going to do, a group of us there. And a fellow called John Simpson, who subsequently became Professor of Strategic Studies at Southampton University, he was a year ahead of us. He was listening to us and he said, well, look, why don't you think about doing international relations? And there's this very interesting guy who's just been appointed to the international relations sub-department, which was in the law school. He's worth going and talking to and seeing whether, in fact, this would be interesting to you. And so we said, okay, well, sort of give this a go. And this person was the only professor in that whole program who would bother to actually give a 1 hour spiel on what he was doing and what an international relations degree was and what it was worth and what it could actually set you up to do and what his ideas were and how he was actually going to structure the thing. So we went and listened to him. And I think about a third of that particular year cohort actually decided to do international relations. So for the next 2 years, we did international relations. And the professor in question was an Australian former diplomat called John Burton. And that was how I got into the international relations game. It wasn't conflict at that particular point in time, but the way John taught it, it certainly wasn't classical international relations. It was certainly not, looking at balance of power theory or, I remember one of the other professors, I think from the LSE, sort of saying at that time, well, really the only book you need to read to understand international relations is you really ought to read Thucydides' The Peloponnesian War. And that will teach you everything about international relations. Mm-hmm. John had a slightly different angle on things. So that was how I got into international relations, and that was how I first came into contact with John Burton and with University College. And that's the sort of background to that.
So what was it called? Was there a field? Peace and conflict studies? How was it framed or understood at the time? Or was that before we could even say there was a recognized field framed as a field?
Oh, I think it was well before that. Though there were there were sort of stirrings and little seedlings growing up here, there, and everywhere, very isolated. I'm looking at this very much from a British point of view.
Mm-hmm. Because '57 was also the year that things happened in the U.S. and
right.
For instance, with Johan Galtung and Prio.
Yes, and it was the year that the Journal of Conflict Resolution first came out, and the people at Michigan started work there. Well, we knew about them, but it was still, if you'd asked me in 1966 when I graduated what I'd been doing, I would have said, I was doing a degree in international relations. Mm-hmm. And international relations at that time, as a field, had its own sort of conflicts and dynamics going on within it. It was a time, at least in Britain, when what you could call a behavioural revolution, which started over here, which was an attempt to apply scientific approaches to the study of politics generally, mm-hmm. and international politics in particular, was sort of it started over here in the 1950s. It got to Britain in the 1960s, and I mean, going back to the sort of decision that we made as undergraduate students, we were going to do this international relations things. So we started in our second year, having lectures and classes in international relations, and we suddenly found ourselves in the middle of the most unholy row about what was the nature of international relations. Could one be scientific about this, and what the hell did being scientific mean? Political science, well, it wasn't even called political science in Britain. It was usually called politics and government or something like that. Mm-hmm. And international relations were unbelievably backward. I rather liked them because it was very much a sort of, how did you study international relations? Well, you read history and you studied institutions like the United Nations. And that was the way you did it. This business about behavioralism and about being scientific and being comparative and, God forbid, using numbers, using statistics, it was this newfangled, wretched American thing which some people had fallen for. Including, my old colleague Dennis Sandoli, who was at this time sort of up in Strathclyde doing his PhD. Mm-hmm. So there was this sort of row going on, or if you like, intellectual debate, between those who were of the old guard and who were sort of defending traditional British attitude and way of studying international relations, and these sort of new, young, American-influenced people. And it actually boiled down, in our experience, to, and again I'm thinking back now to being an undergraduate in the mid-60s, to this tremendous difference between international relations as it was taught at University College and international relations as it was taught at London School of Economics. I mean, the two establishments are, a quarter of a mile from each other in the middle of London. Mm-hmm. But as far as intellectual background was concerned, they were on different planets. Mm-hmm. And so there was this constant tension between the traditional international relations, or the classical approach as it was called. And there was a wonderful example of this that a scholar from the London School of Economics called Hedley Bull, who was also an Australian, wrote a piece in World Politics, which was the main journal, very prestigious journal for international relations, called International Relations Theory, the Case for the Classical Approach, which brought an avalanche of responses from American scholars saying, somebody once said, I think it was Morton Kaplan, it is no secret that British political science is less than rigorous. It's nasty things that you can say about your colleagues. And I mean, John and the rest of the people at University College, particularly a younger scholar called John Groom, were in the thick of this debate. So nobody, in that sense, bothered about conflict or conflict resolution or anything like that. They were too engaged, in the case of John Burton, for example, of trying to undermine the realist school of international relations theory. Use and manipulation of power, etc., as being the central idea of international relations theory, that if you wanted to understand what was going on, then you started off reading books like Hans Morgenthau, which starts off with a statement, something like, the search for power is universal in time and space, full stop. And if you want to understand anything about politics, that's what you have to understand. So, I mean, it was very confusing for us for a start because, John never made any concessions to our lack of background. He would go straight into the opening lecture of his class talking about the shortcomings of power political theory. Now, we didn't have a clue what the hell power political theory was about. And so, on the one hand, we were trying to read up on the stuff that he was attacking so that we understood on what ground he was attacking it. The end of the second year, I think, I remember having a beer with one of my friends and saying, do you know what we've just done? Dick said, no, I'm utterly confused. And we were utterly confused at the end of the second year. By the end of the third year, I think we were beginning to get some kind of a handle on what was happening. So. But on the other hand, you see, there were all sorts of things that were going on at the same time that we didn't know about as undergraduates. We got sort of little echoes of what was happening. For example, around about this time, the International Peace Research Association was being started up.
And the time you're referring to now?
I think 1964 was the date it started.
Okay.
Very much people involved in that were, Kenneth Boulding and Elise Boulding, Bert Rolling, the Dutch former diplomat. There were a group of Dutch scholars at Groningen. There was the Scandinavians, particularly the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, which had been founded by Johan Galtung, a young, brilliant, pushing scholar in the late 50s. And all of this was sort of beginning to have an effect upon, British international relations thinking and people who were interested in doing something about conflict. I mean, you've got to remember that this is, we're talking about the end of the 50s, the beginning of the 60s, the height of the Cold War. It's, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the beginning of the thaw that sort of followed that, the beginning of sort of peaceful coexistence, etc., etc. It wasn't all swinging London, all sorts of things going on. Mm-hmm. And so people were beginning to get interested in, well, if you can be scientific about international relations, surely you can be scientific, you can be comparative, you can be, at least you can get out of this sort of single case study mindset as regards doing something about conflict. And many of the people that we've talked to already, have sort of given you the idea, which I think is a quite accurate one, that the thing that pushed them into thinking about, I'm a psychologist, can I think about ways in which my field will throw some light on avoiding nuclear Armageddon, was very much a sort of a common feeling among scholars in various parts of the world. So, we were coming at this from an international relations perspective. Others were coming at it from a social psychology perspective. Others were coming at it from a, there were anthropologists. You mentioned Anatole Rappaport a little while ago. Anatole was a mathematician. So there was this whole stream of thought and ideas that came from an interest in mathematics and game theory to try to understand, conflicting situations.
So what should we see the field as, or how should we think of it, sort of in between the Peloponnesian Wars and the First World War or the Second World War? That's my first question. And the second one, which I'll remind you of, it's always bad to ask two questions at the same time, is sort of a little more about the zeitgeist, the atmosphere, just after the Second World War. But let's start with, so if we want to talk about this as a field, how far should we go back? The Peloponnesian Wars, the Anglo-Boer War, the Crimean War, opposition to the First World War. How would you frame all of that?
Well, I think I'd reframe it obviously as a historian would.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I tried to do in my teaching, and I tried to do it when I was teaching in London to undergraduates, but I've also tried to do it over here to sort of teaching postgraduates, is to say that although the people did not think about themselves as being part of a field of conflict analysis and resolution, it's perfectly possible to trace back the ancestry of our field to the Peloponnesian War and then forward again through the centuries by talking about people who have put forward schemes and ideas for the peaceful resolution of conflict or the peaceful control of conflict. And secondly, that it's perfectly possible to look back throughout history, and I think particularly in the 19th century, to a very strong influence in our field, which is peace activism. That in fact, if you look back at the first strand, which is sort of thinking about peace, and a whole series of people starting. You can start with the poet Dante Alighieri, for example, is one of the people who actually started to produce a plan, a scheme for the peace of Europe. And then again, then you should branch off into some of the Spaniards like Vittoria, who were interested in the application of legal remedies to wars and started the development of international law, part of which is the international law of armed conflict, and that comes right. There's that strand which comes right up to date. And then there are a whole series of people writing in the 19th century. But the 19th century, I think, was very, very much an era of peace activism. There are an astonishing number of peace movements, people actually banding themselves together to prevent war and violence. One of the things that one sort of remembers about the 19th century is it was a very long period of so-called peace. Well, it was peace in Europe, but it certainly wasn't peace on the American frontier, for example. But we tend to ignore that. Okay, but it was a long period when there were really no major wars, as there had been in the Napoleonic period, and as there was going to be from 1914 to 18. Okay, so there's this lot, but it was also during a period, I think, of enormous hope, but enormous organisation. If you think back to some of the organisations, there was a wonderful one which actually was a forerunner to the thinking about setting up the League of Nations after the First World War. It was very strong in the United States, and it was called the League to Enforce the Peace. Hundreds, thousands of members joined that league and had a very profound impact on the thinking of President Wilson. Mm-hmm. So that if you're asking when does our field start, I've always sort of said it starts as a self-conscious field in the 1950s, right? Mm-hmm. But if you add in peace and you add in peace activism, mm-hmm. then you go back to the 13th century in Europe.
Okay.
And I'm sure that if we knew more about it and we knew more about Islamic culture, that there were people who were writing about peace and conflict in that as well.
Okay. So my second question as part of this was then thinking of what I would then call, what you've just called the modern history, or the conscious history of the field, being the early 50s. What was it about that period, and to what degree was it the Second World War, that provided the seeds, the German word Zeitgeist, the atmosphere in which that all became possible or needed, or the fact that people wanted to do something about war and wanted to talk about peace?
I mean, I think my answer has to be a very Eurocentric answer. That's where I come from, and that's what I know about. And I think one of the things that struck me about talking to some of the people that we've interviewed, who are, a sort of generation slightly older than me, and people who actually served in that war. I mean, you remember talking to Morton Deutsch, who was a navigator in a bomber squadron in the war. Roger Fisher was a meteorological officer with the 8th Air Force. Dave Singer was in the Navy. Some of the others that we haven't actually talked to, their background is that war. And they all more or less say the same thing, that they came to the conclusion at the end of that war that this was a stupid way of handling major conflicts. Because you can look at the Second World War in a variety of ways. One of the ways to look at it is to think of it as round two. It's the second round of the First World War. So more or less the same players in it, sort of more or less the same round. How in God's name did we actually manage to sort of fight a world war, two world wars, in 20 years apart? And I think that was one of the things that underlay the beginning of the efforts in the 1940s, which, if you like, started off with the attempt to set up the United Nations in, the San Francisco Conference. And it was one of the interesting things about actually being taught by John, was that he'd been there. He'd been there as part of the Australian delegation in this effort to set up this organisation that was supposed to save the world from the scourge of war. Right? And, he would tell fascinating stories about the role of the Australian delegation, together with the Indians, the Canadians, the South Africans as well, in trying to head off some of the things which they saw were going to be wrong with the United Nations if setting up the United Nations was left simply to the 5 so-called victor powers. So, saying this thing started in the 1950s is, like all generalizations, is an exaggeration, because there were certainly seeds. The setting up of UNESCO, for example, was part of this whole effort to deal with the root causes of war. All of the stuff in Chapter 7, which has to do with peace and security, which is in the hands of the Security Council. That was dealing with, what you could call the surface manifestations and the crisis times, whereas a lot of the stuff which, according to John, tended to be put in by the Indian delegation in association with some of the other smaller countries, including the Australians, that came in from them. I remember John saying at one point, that the atmosphere was among the delegates from the great powers, from the Soviet Union, from the United States, Britain, China, France, was, all right, we will look after the important stuff, we'll look after the business of keeping the peace. You guys, all right, if you want to monkey around with social things and cultural things and education, it's all right, go ahead, you can do that. And that got put into the UN Charter mainly because of the activities of people like Mike Pearson, the Canadian delegate. So there was that, but of course it all went wrong. Well, not all of it, but if you think about the whole setup, the whole peace and security setup at the United Nations was really that peace and security was going to be in the hands of a trade union of the great powers. Right? It was going to be the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. That's the whole thing about the veto. And it all actually depended on the five great powers continuing to agree among themselves as to what would be done. Now, we all know what happened to that. You know, by 1945, it was going to hell in a handcart. So the Cold War was beginning. So it wasn't quite so much the Second World War that affected what happened in the 1950s. I think it was the Cold War. I think it was the fact that what the victor powers had tried to establish in the 1940s was obviously not working. That you were in this sort of dreadful situation in the 1950s where the wartime consensus had very rapidly fallen apart, and you've got the Cold War, and you've got this terrible process of continuing escalation of the arms race. And you got to the point where people were talking about MAD, you know, which, for the information of anybody who is under the age of 30, does not mean Mothers Against Drunk Driving. It means mutually assured destruction. And it would have been mutually assured destruction. And I think that was the trigger. That was this, what you call the zeitgeist. It was the sheer fear that unless something was done about it, and you know, I as a social psychologist, I as a historian, I as a mathematician, have a duty to try to see if I can use my skills to try to do something to get us out of that thing. I mean,
But the root fear of that was also the way that Second World War ended.
Yes, I think that's probably right. I mean, there's a sort of continuation of, you know, here we've got the Red Army, you know, in the middle of Europe, and unless we actually, unless we deter them, you know, they'll be rolling up the steps of Buckingham Palace before you know where you are.
I was actually more thinking about Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
Well, yes, I mean, that was the other side of things, and I really didn't start thinking about this until I was actually in the Air Force. You know, you're getting on with your life, and you know that there are nuclear weapons about the place, but you know, you can't do anything about it, so you just have to live with that. And not just nuclear weapons. I mean, I remember being given a lecture by a flight sergeant in the Air Force about chemical weapons, you know, about the kinds of nerve gases that the Germans had produced during the Second World War, and the fact that people were stockpiling those as well. You know, there are all sorts of horrors. And the other thing that sort of convinced me, at least for a while, that something had to be done about this, though I didn't actually sort of think that I could do anything about it, was, well, what we just heard. Jets flying overhead. One of the jobs I had in the Air Force was to keep track of the movement of planes in British airspace, which sort of extended across the North Sea towards, you know, the threat. And at that stage, at least, and again, this is the sort of 1953, 1954, 1955, and I got called back in 56 in the summer. At that stage, the Royal Air Force was trying to refight the Battle of Britain, you know, from 1940. What they were trying to do was to update a system which had defeated the Luftwaffe in 1940, whereby you could see enemy planes approaching Great Britain on a radar screen, and you then sent up fighters to try and shoot these bombers down. Now, even in 1940, if you intercepted 25% of the planes coming over, you were doing extremely well. If you shot down 10% of them, you were having a hell of a good day. The rest of them bombed you. Right? And you know, I can assure you that being bombed is not a very pleasant experience, even at the age of 10. But what the RAF was trying to do in the 1950s was exactly the same thing, except that, as you say, Hiroshima and Nagasaki had happened. So if in fact there were incoming planes that were carrying nuclear weapons, and you shot down 10% of them, 20% of them, 50% of them, didn't matter a damn. You know, somebody once did a study that sort of said if you drop 6 5-megaton nuclear bombs on the west side of Britain, and they were dirty nuclear bombs, then the prevailing winds would turn the rest of the island into a desert. And we knew, you know, we weren't stupid. We knew that we couldn't stop them. There was no way we could stop them. So I used to, you know, after I came out of the RAF and I started school teaching, for a couple of years afterwards, I would occasionally get woken up by jets going overhead. And I knew very well, this was before the era of, you know, jet airliners, I knew they had to be, I hoped, RAF fighters, because if they weren't RAF fighters, then we were in real trouble.
Okay.
And that was the sort of how terrifying the time was. And that, I think, was the spur that, rather late with me, but with a lot of other people, you know, with people who were like 10 years my senior, sort of pushed them into that study.
So having said the atmosphere for the 50s and early 60s, you were a student of John Burton's. So give us an overview of how the field in Britain then developed. At that time, seemingly starting to compete with the disciplines, but also just from Burton onwards, different people, different strands. How did we sort of move from 55 to 75, so to speak? Is that the right block of time to talk about even?
It's as good as any. Maybe from sort of the mid-60s to the mid-70s, because there really wasn't much going on in Britain in the late 50s. There's much more going on over here, much more going on in Scandinavia.
And while you're talking about going on, was this peace and conflict studies? Was it peace studies? How was it framed?
I mean, that was the interesting thing. It was one of the things I've actually picked up, you know, doing the interviews. Yes, I think they were self-consciously in this country, and particularly in Scandinavia, and also I think probably in some of the European continental countries, they were quite self-consciously interested in understanding peace and conflict, and they started using those terms. I mean, if you think back, in 1957, there was a group of people at Michigan University in Ann Arbor had got together, and I mean, they were the Bouldings and David Singer, Robert Angel, Dean Pruitt was there, Herb Kelman was there. They had actually started the whole thing rolling by deliberately calling their journal, which they produced, the Journal of Conflict Resolution. And nobody quite knew where did this fit in? Conflict resolution? What was that? Political science? What was it?
It was also 57, right?
That was 57, and then a few years later, the peace research people in Oslo produced a Journal of Peace Research. And the interesting thing is that there's always been this sort of slight tension between, you know, the American science of conflict. Well, we call it conflict. We started calling it conflict research in England in the mid-60s when we got conscious of this. The Scandinavians always talked much less ashamedly about peace. I mean, one of the concomitants of the Cold War, of course, was, you know, as has happened with the word freedom now, the word peace has became a dirty word. Partly it was because I think that the Soviets actually used the term peace for many of the things that they set up, which were sort of front organizations for defending Soviet foreign policy. You know, you talk about the European Peace Committee, and you looked at it, and it was probably heavily weighed in the favor of people from Eastern Europe, and some Westerners as well, of course. It was probably funded out of Moscow.
So peace was a propaganda term at the
Peace was a
time.
propaganda term in the 1950s. You know, if you said the word peace, then you were immediately suspect in some circles in this country and in Western Europe, because the Soviets had hijacked that term. But the Scandinavians weren't afraid of it. That was sort of the interesting thing, that they actually were quite happy to use the term peace. So when PRIO put out its journal, it was the Journal of Peace Research. Right? I think one of the first people to use the word peace unashamedly in an institution was Walter Izard, who had an organization which was a kind of a peripatetic conference, an annual conference which moved from place to place. And this was run by Walter's organization, which was called the Journal of, not the Journal, I get this right, Peace Research Society International. PRSI.
Which still exists?
It still exists. Well, it exists, but this jumps ahead to the 1970s. It then changed its name to the Peace Science Society International.
All right. That's what he talked about when we interviewed.
That's right.
Yeah.
And as you gathered, the reason he had to change the name was because in the early 70s, the Scandinavians, particularly some of the extreme left in Scandinavia, in PRIO, actually attacked American peace research as being self-serving apologies for American policy in Vietnam. So Walter sort of said, all right, if that's the case, we are going to be scientific, we're not politically, so that was
okay. We need to talk about the divisions within the field itself, and also about the differences in research methodology. But let's keep those two things for a next question and go back to Britain.
Fun.
So the British history of those 20 years of the mid-60s to or 10 years, the block of time you suggested was mid-60s, mid-70s. I mean, how did we move into what was the early work that John did, into the workshop model and all those things?
Okay. The sort of British story is always fairly small, fairly underfunded, and somewhat marginal, with a couple of exceptions. I said that in the early 1960s, and I can't remember the date, I think it was 1964, people like Kenneth Boulding and some of the Scandinavians got together and they set up the International Peace Research Association, which was a network of scholars from different places and different departments. And you've got to remember that there weren't any departments of conflict studies. There certainly weren't any departments of peace studies. I think the one in Bradford, which was set up in maybe 79, I think it was the very first one in Britain anyway, that was a department of peace and conflict studies. The thing that was happening though was that there were sort of isolated people, individuals in academia that were interested in the United Kingdom, in what was going on in the United States, and in starting up some kind of organization that was interested in peace and conflict, right? That linked people together because they were all sort of terribly isolated. And this was the Conflict Research Society. People felt that conflict was safe, research was safe, and after all, we are academics, and that's a respectable thing to do. So it was a kind of an academic network focused in Britain. So that happened, I think that was set up in 65. Okay, so all of this was going on, and all of this was being pushed by John and by a small group of people who were mainly Quakers. I mean, Adam Curl, for example, at that stage was very definitely a Quaker, though he subsequently sort of became a sort of Quaker / Buddhist, Quddist, something like that. I mean, the Quakers were the ones who were interested in peace, obviously. Going back to your earlier question, if you look at the history of the development of the peace movement, the Quakers have a central part in that. And they were the ones who would actually pony up some money for it. I mean, a lot of the money for what was going on in Britain at this stage came from the Cadbury Trust and the Rowntree Trust, which, if anybody knows anything about Britain, it's chocolate money. You buy a bar of chocolate in London, and it's either a Rowntree or a Cadbury. The other firm I think has gone bankrupt. That was the Fry's. They were Quakers as well. They were Elizabeth Fry, prison reform, etc., etc. Okay. So the Quakers were very, very keen in setting up institutions. They were very keen in setting up networks. If you wanted funding for a particular project that had something to do with peace, then you caught a train to York and you went and you talked to one or other of the Quaker foundations. Right? So this was going on in the early 1960s. But again, you've got to understand that it was, the universities were really not sort of interested in this. If you were an anthropologist and you had this strange interest in doing something about the Cold War, that's fine. You do it on your own time. As long as in those days, British universities were much more relaxed than they are now. Certainly much more relaxed than so that as long as you taught your classes, as long as you turned up at least for half of your lectures and gave the lectures, then that was fine. You could go off and do your own thing, and nobody. It was very, very, very loose, very sort of flaky. Good time. So I mean, the idea was to sort of pull together these individuals from places like the University of Aberystwyth or Strathclyde or wherever, and keep the network going. And that was the Conflict Research Society, and a sort of a network of like-minded scholars who were interested in research into conflict. Okay, problem-solving workshops.
Was that the main strand of thought that one should be thinking of in terms of the development of the field? Or
no, not at all. Not at all. I mean, these were all, there wasn't the main strand of thought. There were sort of little bits and pieces going on here, there, and everywhere. No, that came about. Let me backtrack a bit. My last year as an undergraduate, okay. We, as a group of undergraduates, knew that our professors were up to something. Undergraduates always suspect their professors of being up to something or other. And we were right on this occasion. I mean, they would sort of come in late for lectures, and then they would sort of go off smiling smugly as if they'd got this big secret. And what we didn't realize, that what they were doing was that they were inventing problem-solving workshops. They didn't know this at the time, of course, because what had happened was, as part of this row, this intellectual debate between, what you could call the traditionalists, if you like, and the behavioralists, which is the way it was expressed at the time, in international relations, which, I mean, frequently came to a head at, conferences where people would present papers and people from the other side would be, in that wonderful British way, spitefully rude about the papers that the other side was giving. Eventually it came to the point where, simplifying crudely, a group of traditional professors, senior professors from the LSE, I think sort of more or less turned around to John Burton and said, well, if you're so smart, if your ideas are good, do something about a conflict. Show us that your ideas work. Which was a challenge that, John and his group, it's a very small group, couldn't turn down. So they said, all right. So I am told, and this is all second-hand stuff that John has told me. They said, okay, do something about the Middle East. Even in those days, the Middle East was sort of, not exactly the garden of peace. Very sensibly, John sort of said, no, I'm not going to do anything about that. Now, this was 64, so we're talking about a time in the Middle East between the 56 war, which is the one that everybody forgets about, and the 67 war. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So John sort of said, no, I'm not going to do that. However, there is this nasty little conflict which is going on at the moment in the Far East, between the Indonesians and the Malaysians, which the British government was involved in because the Malaysians didn't have any military. So there was a British, it's like the British Army being in Afghanistan at the moment. The British Army was actually in Malaysia preventing the Indonesians infiltrating over the borders and causing mayhem, violence, etc., etc. The Indonesians had actually come to the conclusion that the so-called independence of Malaysia was a sham, and basically Malaysia was simply a British surrogate. The main thing they were worried about was this huge military base in Singapore. Okay, so there was this it was called confrontation or konfrontasi in Indonesian, which is, I think, the only Javanese word I know. Now, the thing about that was that John, when he had been with the Australian Foreign Ministry, and he ended up, of course, being the head of the Australian Foreign Ministry as a top civil servant. And then he had the minister above him, was an interesting guy called Herb Evatt. So, and while he was in that position, and we're now talking about the end of the 1940s, the Indonesians were struggling for independence from the Dutch. Indonesia used to be the Dutch East Indies, for the information of anybody who can't think back that far. And John had actually persuaded the Australian government that it was in their long-term interests to support the Indonesians, not to support the Dutch coming back. Right? And so he'd done various things like, block the transportation of arms through Australian ports to the Dutch army in Indonesia. Anyway, in the end, the Indonesians achieved their independence. The Dutch pulled out of the Dutch East Indies, and the Australians had very good relations with the new Indonesian government. Okay. Subsequently, John kept up his relations in that part of the world. He went to, this was after he'd been investigated during the Australian McCarthy period. He'd lost his job, but then he did all sorts of things that you're not supposed to do as a former civil servant, like visit China just after the communist takeover. He went to the Bandung Conference, which was the conference in 1955 that set up the non-aligned movement. So he knew these guys. He knew the Malaysians, he knew the Indonesians. It was his part of the world. So what he did was he pulled together a group of academics and practitioners, and he approached the Indonesian government and said, you're stuck, you're in a situation of impasse, you're not getting anywhere. Why don't you try some informal conversations about the possibilities of coming up with some kind of a solution to this dilemma that you're in, and if we do this, I can pull in some experts that can help you do this. Okay. John pulled together a whole group of people, some area experts, some people from the behavioural school. He got a lot of help from people at the Tavistock Institute, which is a sort of not-for-profit NGO in London, part of which does work in psychoanalysis, but part of which has a human resources department, which was doing early conflict resolution work on a commercial basis. And there was a young State Department lawyer who was on a year's sabbatical at the London School of Economics, who was also part of the team, somebody called Roger Fisher. They actually met over something like a 5-6 month period, starting I think in December '65. They had representatives who had been nominated, as far as I can tell, by the respective presidents of Malaysia, Singapore and Indonesia. And I think that I've talked to a lot of the people who were actually involved in this, because we weren't. We were just trying to pass our final examinations as undergraduates, and while this was going on. And they say, I mean, particularly Tony de Rook, who was chairing this thing, that they were making it up as they went along. I mean, they had no idea what they were doing. I mean, the thing that Tony says was that he and John had really profound discussions about the lack of structure and the lack of an agenda. It really troubled people. And the whole issue about what was the role of area experts among the sort of panel of participants came up. So a lot of the things came up that we're familiar with now with regard to sort of problem-solving groups. But anyway, at the end of it, I think it was pretty clear, and I've tried to write this up in Ron Fisher's latest book, that the ideas that they came up with there had a profound impact on the eventual agreements that were signed in Bangkok to end Konfrontasi. And so there was the very first problem-solving approach to a nasty conflict. I mean, it wasn't a major conflict at all. And there was this new technique which they seemed to have developed almost out of nothing. Though obviously there were various people who had ideas about group dynamics and why small groups worked. There were John was reading a lot of stuff out of the casework literature at the time. The Tavistock had adopted some of the ideas of people like Wilfred Bion and the National Training Laboratories for T groups. And so all of that went into that kind of mix, and it seemed to work. So subsequent to that, and again, remember this was when we were in the middle of our final semester trying to get degrees. So this is all second-hand. I think John then went to two places. He went to the Quaker Foundations and said, "Look, we've got this new method. It's going to be called controlled communication. Would you fund us for 3 years so that we could set up a centre which has to do this kind of problem-solving, conflict-resolving work?" And at the same time, he went to the Social Science Research Council in London and said, "We've got this new method. I want to set up this centre to do this work. Here's an application for a grant." So suddenly, by the summer of 1966, he'd got the promise of a considerable amount of money, or at least it was a considerable amount of money in those days. And he'd got this method, and he'd got all sorts of contacts in various parts of the world from his time as the head of the Australian Foreign Service. And that was the beginning of the Centre for the Analysis of Conflict. That was actually the beginning of this whole problem-solving approach. Now, John almost immediately afterwards started work on a book on this method, and I remember sort of saying to him, "How do you know that it works?" And we had this long methodological argument about there only being a couple of cases where it's been tried. How dare you write a book about 2 cases? Anyway, he went ahead and wrote it, and that was the book that subsequently came out in 1969 called Conflict and Communication. So that was where that comes from.
And then other people, Doob and others in America, followed this model? How did that happen?
That happened, I think, because there were others who were interested in small group dynamics and the use of small groups, separate, isolated, insulated from public pressure, to try to thoroughly examine the underlying roots of the conflict that they found themselves in. Okay. Now, Doob was at Doob, and he was actually being helped by, he was a Yale psychologist. He was helped by a political scientist from Harvard called Bill Foltz. And they got interested in the use of this kind of method. And I remember them coming and talking to John and the rest of us in the fall of '67 and saying, much to my personal chagrin, that they were interested in the Horn of Africa. They were interested in all of the problems in the Horn of Africa that were going on between the Ethiopians and the Somalis and the people in Djibouti, and they were proposing to run a series of workshops on that, which they duly did, and published a book which I think was called the Fermata Workshop, after the place where they actually held the thing. But I mean, the thing that really that really accelerated or boosted or started up the adoption of this particular approach were really I mean, I give Doob his credit, but really and truly speaking, it was the people that John involved in some of the exercises. I mentioned Roger Fisher was part of this particular exercise.
People like Herb Kelman?
Well, Herb came on the second of these experiments, which dealt with the Cyprus conflict. And I mean, this is, if again I can get a bit sort of personal on this to sort of explain how I got involved in this, because all of this was going on while I was triumphantly completing my degree. Okay, so I sort of finished the degree in the summer.
The degree being now?
It was a Bachelor of Science in Economics with a specialization in international relations.
Okay.
It's a bit of a mouthful, but you know, sort of whatever. And so, you know, there I was, the end of the semester. In England, universities have 3 terms, and the third one ends around about the beginning of July. And from beginning of the summer to the beginning of July, I've been writing off letters of application for jobs in schools, because it was my intention to go back and, you know, become the head of a history department or something like that. And much to my amazement, nobody was interested in me. I was really furious about it. How dare they turn me down? Here I was with 7 years' experience and, you know, a degree. And then I heard that John was organising this Centre for the Analysis of Conflict, and so I plucked up courage and went and saw him and said, I understand you're, you know, setting up a research centre. Do you have a job for me?
Just to be clear now, which university are we talking about?
This is University College London, which
Okay.
is one of the constituent parts of London University.
Okay.
London University is a sort of confederal, not confederate system.
Okay.
And he sort of responded in his usual way, which is to say something like, what makes you think I would give you a job? And I said, well, you know, you've taught me for 2 years, and, you know, I've got an upper second degree, which isn't the same as a first, but some people think it's better. So I think he said something like, I have to appoint a secretary tomorrow, come and see me the day after tomorrow. So he thereupon appointed somebody as a secretary. And I went and saw him, and he said, okay, you know, you start on Monday. You see what I mean about British universities being much looser and flakier in those days than American universities. You know, there was none of this business about, you know, search committees and one thing and another. So I said, okay, thank you. You know, it was a job, and my parents, who went through the Depression, always brought me up to believe that the important thing is you had a good, steady job. And I didn't really get excited about it until I realised what the job involved. And I said, well, you know, okay, what do I do? And, you know, he said, you hold the fort until I get back. And he then took off on what was supposed to be a return to Australia, but it actually turned out that what he was doing was he was activating a lot of his previous contacts to see if this mechanism, this process, which they'd sort of stumbled on, could be used and applied in other situations. So he, aside from sort of visiting Jakarta and Kuala Lumpur and Singapore to check up on what was happening with the Indonesia-Malaysia thing, which was winding down, the thing that sort of they'd actually got a very simple, very straightforward agreement, an official agreement, which my interviewee said was very much like some of the notes that they'd sort of finally sent back with the participants. He went to Cairo, and he went to Nicosia and various other places, and on the way back from Australia he called in at the United Nations, where he knew a large number of people, including the Secretary General, who at that point was, I think, U Thant. And apparently U Thant said to him, we have this sort of terrible problem in Cyprus because nobody will talk to my special representative, who's a special rep in Cyprus at the moment. The Turks won't because the Greeks will. The Greeks don't want to until the Turks actually make some concessions. Can you actually do something about that situation? So when he came back from this sort of trip around the world, he had two things. One was Cyprus, and the other was Arab-Israeli relations. And those were the two things that this new Centre for the Analysis of Conflict was going to work on. Mm-hmm. So the second of these sort of experimental problem-solving workshops turned out to be Cyprus.
Okay.
Right? And on that, he pulled together, apart from the people who were part of this new centre, he pulled together 3 American academics, including the social psychologist from Harvard called Herb Kelman. And it was Herb Kelman who got absolutely fired up by this process. And from that point onwards, actually started to take it seriously, not just as a means of intervening, but as a means of studying conflicts and as a means, as a worthwhile topic of study in and of itself.
Okay.
So you can see a whole stream of articles coming out written by Herb, and some with Nadim, with Nadim Rouhani,
Okay.
about that.
Now help me understand this. We're now in the 60s, early 70s.
1967, 68.
Okay.
Okay. Herb then moving on into the 70s.
Right. So I think you already said that the workshop model really wasn't the main thrust of the field as it was pertaining to Britain. So how should we then see what was happening there in terms of the development of the field? Which other organizations, institutions, and people became what became the peace and conflict studies in Britain as it moved into the 70s and 80s?
Okay. It was something of a struggle because there were really only 3 places that could be said to be institutionalizing the peace and conflict field. Right? One was University College, which is where the Centre for the Analysis of Conflict was. The other was Lancaster University, which is up in the northeast of the country. And there were a group of scholars that were interested in the formal analysis of conflict using mathematical models and statistical techniques. And they included, and I mean, they were literally hanging on by their fingernails. Again, they were kept going by Quaker money. And that was a researcher called Paul Smoker, and a mathematical economist called Michael Nicholson, a sociologist called Robin Jenkins, a mathematician called Gordon Hilton, and there were a couple of others. So, we're talking about 5 people. I mean, if you're talking about the Centre for the Analysis of Conflict, you're talking about 5 people, basically. So there were those 2 centres, if you like. And then shortly afterwards, a somewhat renegade psychologist called Bram Oppenheim started up a thing called the Conflict Research Unit at the London School of Economics. Now, all of these things were funded by what, in this country you'd call soft money. In the case of CAC, it was money from Quakers and from the Social Science Research Council. In the case of the Richardson Institute up in Lancaster, it was Quaker money again. In the case of the Conflict Research Unit, they'd got a grant from the Social Science Research Council for a pilot study that they were going to carry out. So, I mean, the thing that I learned from this experience and the experience of the Centre for the Analysis of Conflict, I think it's a pretty general lesson, which is that universities are absolutely delighted to have these innovative and experimental centres or whatever institutes, whatever, as long as they don't have to fork out any money for it. As long as they can bring in money from outside, everybody's delighted with them. If the money stops, then the centre collapses. And that happened to the Conflict Research Unit. It happened to the Centre for the Analysis of Conflict after a while. And it also happened to the Richardson Institute, which sort of has limped along for the last 30 years up at Lancaster. So really and truly, really and truly speaking, in Britain anyway, until the setting up of the Department of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Bradford, there wasn't an institution that was firmly financially settled and
supported by university.
supported by the university, and even that started off with Quaker money, again paying for professors. I mean, Adam Curl was the first professor there. He was funded by the Quakers.
And this was in the late 60s?
So this was in the late 70s.
Late 70s.
Late 70s. So it was it was a struggle all the time. Jim Lowy, who was one of the first people sort of appointed at the institute here, used to have this lovely song that he would sing, which the refrain goes. It's supposed to be a song sung by one of the university administrators, and the refrain goes something like, "If you've got the money, honey, I've got the line." So.
Yeah. So you brought us up to the Richardson Institute, Bradford. Is that it? What happened since? And in asking that, I want to remind you of our trip together to various people and places. And I have this memory of you saying to me on a train somewhere, one day when you interview me, you must ask me about the origins of British ADR, or ADR in Britain.
Well, now you're going into the 70s and the 80s.
Okay.
And I think even in this country, you're actually going into the 70s if you're talking about alternative dispute resolution being used for local community conflicts or for family conflict or whatever. Because, and again, I have to sort of fall back on sort of being personal. I'd never heard of ADR until the early 1980s. And the only reason that I heard about it was I was then teaching at City University in the centre of London in a department of systems analysis, which it was the only place that I could find a job. Mm-hmm. There were no jobs in conflict resolution. All of the jobs in international relations tended to go to, sort of rather mainstream traditionalists or to people who were interested in strategic studies. Almost everybody who originally was at the Centre for the Analysis of Conflict ended up in departments which formally had almost nothing to do with the study of conflict. Again, that was something that you did in your spare time. Mm-hmm. While you were in the Department of
Systems Analysis.
Systems Analysis, or the Department of Russian and Linguistic Studies, which is where my colleague Tony Derouk ended up.
Yes.
So, the whole thing about institutionalization really didn't come about until the field got respectable in the 1990s and the 2000s. I mean, it's still not very big in the UK. Richardson Institute is still going. Bradford is the major centre for Britain. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's. I don't know whether this is a sort of indicator of how important it is, but I think it's the only department in Britain which has ever been investigated as being subversive by the British government.
Uh-huh. And you should maybe explain why.
Oh, because
I remember them telling us about it, but
it was they. A lot of them wrote some published articles around about the time of the Falklands-Malvinas War, which, again, for those of you who are too young to remember, it was a war between Argentina and Britain over the islands in the South Atlantic that the British call the Falklands, the Argentinians call Las Malvinas. Okay. I mean, it is clearly the case, as far as the British are concerned, that they're British. As the Duke of Wellington once said, we stole them fair and square. At the time of the war, to write articles that suggested that there may be another side to this, and maybe if you were going to try to understand why the war had actually taken place, that it was necessary to empathize, not sympathize, empathize with the Argentinian project, was regarded by the then British government, who was, of course, they were headed by my favorite politician, Mrs. Thatcher. This was regarded as, tantamount to treason. And so apparently the Department of Peace and Conflict Studies at Bradford was put on the list for MI5 to investigate. Sorry, but they survived that.
So Chris, just very briefly, how did you end up at ICAR, before I ask a couple of other questions just about other institutions in Britain? And then I want to just talk about, so what about the rest of Europe? But just very briefly, to bring your history up to date till where we all know, and I met you as a doctoral student in 1988. How did that all come about?
I think what happened was, as I said, it was a terrible struggle during the 70s and the early 80s to get people interested. Let me back off that. It was very easy to get students interested in the topic of sort of conflict research, conflict analysis, conflict resolution. It was much more difficult to get universities interested in setting up centres or whatever in Britain. It took me something like 10 years before I could persuade my university, where I ended up, City University, to even put on a single course on conflict analysis, even in a department as sort of loose as Department of Systems Analysis. And in the end, what I had to do is I managed to get the curriculum board to accept a course on conflict management. All right. I couldn't call it conflict resolution, but management was okay, because my department was a department. It was actually forming a Department of Systems and Management, so conflict management was all right. And the other thing is that when John was setting up the Centre for the Analysis of Conflict in the mid-60s at University College London, it was a very brief period of expansion for British universities. And it lasted it started in 1964, when the Labour government came in and the then Prime Minister started talking about turning Britain into a 20th century country through I think the phrase he used was the white hot something or other of technological innovation. But when he came to actually technologically innovating at universities, he realized that if you're going to sort of set up engineering departments or medical schools or whatever, it costs a hell of a lot of money. Social sciences and humanities are much cheaper. So if you're going to expand the student body, then the cheapest way of doing that is to have lots of social science courses or humanitarian courses. Now that lasted for about 8 years, a sort of period of expansion in Britain. And then the British economy tanked, as it frequently does, and cuts started to be made in universities. It happened at University College, which is why the Centre for the Analysis of Conflict, which by that time was really reduced to 2 or maybe 3 people, got moved from University College down to Kent. And that happened all the time. That happened all the time. There was no expansion going on. Governments would come in and say, we must expand. Well, at one point it was Russian studies. We have to have Russian speakers to understand what's going on as détente or coexistence comes into effect. And then it became business studies. And
But in the end, we got you because of that history.
in the end, you got me because of that history, because at one point, I've been sort of working in the Department of Systems and Management and gradually sort of making my way up the sort of British hierarchy. from a sort of lecturer to a senior lecturer to a reader, and then I got sort of made up into a professor, which in Britain is a major step. You know, there aren't many professors in departments, you know, there are one or two or something like that. And I remember that I'd just been promoted to professor. I just sort of had this interview with the board, and they made me professor. And the Vice-Chancellor called me into his office. The Vice-Chancellor in Britain, of course, is the equivalent of the university president.
And we should maybe say that a professor in the British system is something of much higher standing than it is in the American system.
Much higher standing, much lower pay. Anyway, so I just made this. This was 1987, I think, 86, 87. And the Vice-Chancellor sort of called me in and sort of said, congratulations, you know, what plans do you have? And I told him a few things I was planning to do. I wanted to sort of regularize this sort of conflict strand. And he sort of said, well, you know, the problem is I would like to say that I can throw the weight of the university behind you, but to be quite honest, we're going in a completely different direction. He said, you know, I will try to do what I can for you, and if I come across anybody who's interested in funding what you're doing, I will certainly but I have to tell you that we don't have plans for expanding in that direction. I thought, you know, so what do I do now? And at that point, Bryant Wedge, who was the founder of the Institute here, and John Burton, who'd sort of retired from England and come over initially to the University of South Carolina, and then to the University of Maryland, and then to George Mason University, sort of broke, he and Bryant and Joe Semeka, and Dennis probably remembers this much better than I do because he was here, had actually sort of broken through in the sense of getting some serious permanent university support for appointments to the Centre for Conflict Analysis, as it then was. Then became the Centre for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, I think, then it became ICAR.
So the fact that the field was more institutionalized at that point in the US than in Britain is really what eventually made you come here, if I understand it correctly.
Well, yes. I mean, the thing is that there seemed far more opportunities over here. You know, there were far more resources, there were more students, etc., etc. So that was how I ended up in Fairfax, Virginia.
Chris, just very briefly, so we have today in Britain, we haven't mentioned Kent. So just give us a very quick overview of what is now, what did this all come to in Britain, so to speak. And then the one thing, and much of that happened indeed in your absence while you were now at ICAR as of '88 till this day. And maybe just as a quick exercise, jump across the channel and tell us what happened during all this time on the continent.
Okay. I think what's happened in Britain is that, you know, the idea that you can study peace and conflict has become sort of accepted and respectable, which I think is the same thing that's happened over here. So. Now that doesn't mean that there are scads of government money. The thing about British universities, of course, is that they're all, with one exception, I think, they're all funded by the government. I mean, you know, you don't have private universities. You know, you've got Oxford and Cambridge who sort of own half the country, so they're slightly different. But so that, you know, to some extent, you know, what happens in universities is sort of follow the ups and downs of government policy. Now, all sorts of things have happened to universities in the 90s and the 2000s.
But those are more the internal institutionalization of the organizations themselves, etc. But I'm more interested in the field itself in terms of which universities, what are they teaching, how has this all sort of ended up, as I said, in a sense, in your absence, because you were here from '88 onwards.
I think, you know, from that point of view, the whole field is sort of stuck in a kind of an ice age over there, You know, you're not getting, you know, you've got a lot of universities that have departments of politics and international relations, or departments of strategic studies, or, you know, the most honest of the lot is the Department of War Studies at King's College. I mean, at least they're honest about what they're teaching. And incidentally, of course, they actually teach a lot of courses on peace and peace research. So I think what you've got is a lot of departments which have traditional names on them. I mean, I'm thinking about Kent, for example, which is a Department of Government and International Relations, or St Andrews, or one of these others. Well, you've got governments which have got safe, comfortable names on them, but within those departments, frequently you've got courses or, you know, sort of focuses, foci, whatever, on, you know, peace studies, on conflict resolution, etc., etc. And that's, I think, the case in a lot of provincial universities. Now, the one thing that I don't know about at all is that one of the last things the Conservative government did in the mid-90s, before it got flung out, deservedly, and replaced by the Labour government, or new Labour government, I should say, of Tony Blair, was that it decided that, as a gimmick, it would announce that far more 18-year-olds, and indeed far more people in later life that wanted to go to university, would indeed be accommodated at universities. Right. The way they did this, because of course if you do that properly it's going to cost a lot of money, was that they took a lot of technical colleges and they relabeled them as universities. So that there are now something like 8 universities in London.
What's the impact of that on the field?
I don't know. You know, I think that certainly I've noticed in some of the literature that's coming out of Britain is that there are a lot of people, well, maybe not a lot, but there are a certain number of people who are teaching in these new universities that are actually interested in writing in the field.
Okay. But what I find interesting, and I'd like to hear your perception on this, is that it seems that the idea of peace studies, so to speak, Bradford held on to that name, is much more acceptable or accepted in Britain than here.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that's not just Britain. I think it's generally much more accepted in Europe. And, you know, much to everybody's surprise, Britain is part of Europe, and so, you know, you find that there are departments of peace studies in German universities. There are departments of peace studies, growing numbers, in Spain. There are, you know, there are some in Italy. There are places in Europe where it's not respectable. I mean, unless it's changed very much. I mean, I remember going to a conference in Greece where it was like stepping back into the 1960s. You know, there was no sense in which there was anything worth studying other than, you know, the manipulation of power, or the sort of traditional things that, I mean, I'd been studying in the 1960s as part of my international relations degree.
And the French got their own take on it, and the Dutch actually got much more involved.
The Dutch and the Belgians, of course, you know, the smaller countries in Western Europe, yes, I think that they have become involved in it from a pedagogical point of view. And the other interesting thing is that the European Union now has become very, very much involved in financing interventions which have to do with conflict resolution, to do with, you know, sort of the post-conflict peace building. I mean, you know, there's a lot of, you know, if you take money as an indicator, there's a lot of European money going into that. And one of the reasons for this, I suspect, and again, this is something that Dennis Sandoli knows about, is the Helsinki process and the establishment of the OSCE. because one of the things that has happened in the meantime, and one of the points I always try to make with the students when I'm teaching is that ours is a field which is very much affected by what's going on in the world. Now, one of the things that's been going on in the world since the early 1990s, of course, is the collapse of the Soviet Union and the development of all these, in quotes, new conflicts in Eastern Europe, in Transcaucasia, in places like that, in which, many of which anyway, the OSCE becomes involved. And so, where the interest in conflict resolution and peace studies, if one dare call it that, in this country seems to me to be on the decline. In Europe, it's been on the rise for a considerable period of time, and I think that makes a difference to support for university programs and for organizations like the Berghof Institute in Berlin, for example.
I want to move into a series of much more broader questions, but there are two things I just feel I need to ask quickly. So how does a field develop? How does a group of people get to know about each other? How does all this ferment and become something? They go to the same conferences, they meet each other through other ways. What was your sense of how it all sort of came together, if it did, or to the extent that it did in Britain?
I think the weird thing is that academics get their intellectual support outside their own department. There are exceptions to that, I think. But my experience was that if I really wanted to throw some ideas around, then I had to go to like-minded people in other departments. So I think one of the answers to your question is networking. Conferences are important, but the problem is that, if you go back to the beginning of our field, and I think it is a field, I'm not sure whether it's a discipline, but, and you say, well, all right, where did you guys meet? Where did you exchange ideas? There really wasn't anywhere until the 1980s. There's the exception to that is, I think, IPRA, the International Peace Research Association, but IPRA was always strapped for money.
So it's also organizations, not only conferences.
It's not just conferences, but IPRA was a conference giving,
organization giving a conference.
Right? There was the annual IPRA conference.
Which is still in existence.
It's still in existence. The other things is that gradually what happened in the sort of 60s and the 70s and on into the 80s is that you gradually got a situation where you sort of took over a tiny, tiny part of an existing large conference. For example, the International Studies Association conference, which is an enormous jamboree. I mean, it fills Marriott hotels and one thing or another. And there's a peace studies section in there which every year runs some panels and to which academics go and students go, and these are sort of major job markets as well, of course. So you get yourself known that way. ISA, International Studies Association, was important. The the conference of the ISPP, the International Society for Social Psychology, I think was another one which was important. A lot of psychologists were sort of interested in and became part of the field. I mean, always have done, always were. The European, if we're talking about Europe, European Consortium for Political Research has an annual conference, and at that there will be panels and there will be workshops.
But you're also indirectly now referring to the interdisciplinariness. I always think there is such a word, but I can't get it out of my mouth. So people came from different disciplines.
Oh yeah. I mean, you have a sort of parent discipline. I remember going to an ISPP political psychology conference in Mannheim. Must have been about the beginning of the 1980s. And most of the people there, of course, were psychologists. Some of them were even psychiatrists. And I was a sort of odd person out because I didn't have that background. International Studies Association, most of the people at ISA teach international relations. American Political Science Conference. Yeah, I mean, that's what happens. There's a section for each of these very large umbrella organisations. And I think the other thing that you've got to bear in mind, particularly if you're thinking about Britain and you're thinking about how did the British conflict research, whatever, community there, which is a very small one, get involved globally? The answer was with the very greatest difficulty, because of the fact that it takes money to go to a conference. And most British universities are strapped for travel money constantly. I mean, I remember, I think the last year I was at City University, the budget for travel for a department that had something like 15, 16 people in was £1,200. You know, now that will get you to a conference in South London. It won't get you much further. So it was always, there was always the problem about how do you get to these places. Now, I don't know what's happening now with the internet, you know, which is it's a different world.
So what does this all say in terms of the institutionalization of the field itself? You talked about conferences, we talked about programs. These days, I always note as a former journalist that 25 years ago, no one mentioned the word mediation in the media, and they actually didn't use it properly. And now I think there's an acceptance and a proper use of the term.
Yeah.
So overall, what does this all come to in terms of institutionalization?
Well, I think it depends where you're talking about. I mean, if you're talking about here in the States, I think what has happened is that because people are getting used to the idea of mediation, and they're even using terms like, you know, conflict resolution or post-conflict peace building and things like that, is that it's become respectable, and so a lot of people, a lot of universities, a lot of colleges, a lot of educational institutions have set up programs, and that's okay. I mean, I remember Juliana Burkhoff 10 years ago did a sort of study of, you know, how many programs there are. And I think in this country it's in a lot less precarious situation than it is in Britain.
There are over 80 master's programs with different names: peace studies, dispute resolution, conflict resolution, conflict management.
I think that's, so it's well established here, and I think it will not die the death. In Britain, I think it's less well established, but on the other hand, that you do have, you know, fairly, you know, well established institutions like Bradford, but there are very few of them. The other thing that's interesting, though, is I think that's what's happening on the continent. You asked about Europe, and I think that there it's also becoming much more respectable and hence much better established and much better funded and much better organised. I mean, it always has been in Scandinavia. I mean, Scandinavia is quite extraordinary in that.
Chris, there's a bit of a cynic in me that wants to say that a part of our field has been, in a sense, co-opted. Diplomacy especially uses the terminology very actively, but doesn't always apply it so actively. So where does that lead you to your thinking and understanding about institutionalization?
Well, I don't think you can stop people using your language.
No.
I mean, I think you can sort of try to correct them when they misuse it. I mean, I've actually sat in meetings in this town where people have talked about, well, you know, we need to apply some kind of conflict resolution measures to this. Why don't we impose sanctions? You know, and you think, whoops, wait a minute, maybe the understanding of the term conflict resolution hasn't quite reached here. So I don't think you can do anything about that except try to correct it when it happens. The thing that really worries me, and I'm not sure what the answer is to this, is it's not simply being co-opted linguistically. I think it's being co-opted organisationally. And that's why I'm sort of worried about, you know, I know a lot of the students at ICAR got really furious with us last year because the faculty decided that they were not going to join in this latest scheme for getting large sums of money out of USAID via the Office of Conflict Mitigation and Resolution. I think that's I may have the name wrong.
Mm-hmm. You got it right.
And I can say that, I can see their point of view, but I think you have to be very careful about being associated with any government at all. And there's a terrible temptation, if there are sacks of money to be had, that you sort of swallow hard and say, well, we'll be able to control it, or we'll be able to affect it. And I think that's a sort of fairly slippery slope that you go down. I've just actually been associated with a project to try to do something about a country in Africa, to get a sort of civil society dialogue going among the many disaffected groups within this country, okay? And I got asked to sort of go down and assess whether this dialogue was going to be effective or not. Mm-hmm. And I found out after a while that the main reason for this project being pushed, being organized, was that there was something like $750,000 lying around in a US government department waiting for somebody to come up with this kind of an idea. And I thought, the great thing that you have to do, I think, in doing the kind of work that we like to do, which is some kind of an intervention work, is that you have to do it the way you want to do it. You have to do it, and if you can get funding from anywhere to do what you want to do, not what they want to do, then that's sort of all right. It has its dangers.
Who were, in your mind, the early visionaries in the field, coming from whatever discipline within the social sciences? I mean, if you have to give me a list of people that one should really be aware of in the history of the field, who would they be?
I think first and foremost, Kenneth Boulding. I mean, he really was somebody who combined, a sort of really heartfelt interest in peace and peace building with, the idea of sort of rigorous analysis and the use of basically economic methods of sort of trying to understand the dynamics of conflict. I mean, his book, Conflict and Defense, which came out in, I think, 1962, was the first real attempt to try to produce a general theory in a positivist sense. Mm-hmm. But he was also, he was a polymath, really. He was somebody who was very much influenced, again, by his Quaker background. He was an organizer. IPRO was really his and Elise's baby. Mm-hmm. So he'd be one of the first people that I'd suggest as being a key figure. And that was a key figure in the United States. Mm-hmm. Though he's a Liverpudlian, he comes from the northeast of England. Mm-hmm. Clearly Johan Galtung. Mm-hmm. What was striking about talking to some of the people in Oslo, and indeed in other places, is whether they approved of Johan or not, whether they approved of his ideas or not, everybody said that the thing would not have got off the ground in Scandinavia, mm-hmm. in Norway, if it hadn't been for Johan. And I think that's absolutely true. Mm-hmm. I'm not suggesting he invented the field, but certainly his input was absolutely vital. And then there are a number of people that we've missed. If he was still around, at least intellectually speaking, the political scientist from Harvard called Karl Deutsch was really also incredibly influential. He wrote 2 books, one of which was very, very much in John Burton's mind when he was sort of talking about intervention into complex conflict systems. And this was a thing called the nerves of government. And another one which tended to get neglected, but I think was a better book, was one called Nationalism and Social Communication. And they were both intellectually very powerful influences on the way people thought about, at least the academic side of the field. I think from the practical side of the field, I'd say Herb Kelman was really very important. I mean, I hadn't realized that Herb had been at both the Center for Advanced Behavioral Science at Stanford, where a lot of this actually got sort of initially started. But he was certainly in Michigan, and he was the one, as I said earlier, who picked up the idea, the technique of problem solving, and really started to pull it apart and ask, all right, if it works, what do we mean by work, and then what are some of the things that affect whether or not this process has an impact on the people who are there, and then on the conflict system from which they originally came. Okay. So I think Herb certainly really ought to be up there with the rest of them. Somebody that again we missed, and that was Hendrik van der Merwe in South Africa. I mean, if you're looking at Africa and asking, what's the sort of fountainhead of conflict analysis and resolution in the continent, it has to be South Africa, and it has to start with Hendrik. So I think probably he would be, most important. And then, of course, inevitably, from my point of view, John Burton. I mean, he was just extraordinarily dynamic in the 1960s and the 1970s in getting things started, getting things organized. I mean, terribly, terribly ambitious. I mean, he was talking years ago before, International Alert or Conciliation Resources or the Berghoff Institute or any of the other practice organizations were more than a gleam in somebody's eye. I mean, he was talking about what he called an International Green Cross Service, which was going to be a sort of permanent on alert track 2 organization. I mean, it never got off the ground in his sense because he got diverted into, he was originally in, the academic side of things. But, I think the field owes him an enormous intellectual debt, and practical debt as well.
So you mentioned a couple of people that were all sort of in what I would call to some degree the post-war figures. Who were their intellectual fathers? And mothers, of course. And the other thing we haven't mentioned is really influential women.
Well, I mean, I think that's very difficult because thinking back into, even the time when I was around, which was the 1960s, the way academia was structured in Britain, I have less knowledge of over here, but it was pretty much a male-dominated part of academia. I mean, Elise, of course, working with Kenneth, Elise Boulding, you can't sort of neglect the effect that she had on Kenneth's thinking. But aside from that, I mean, there were a couple who were, one particularly, an international lawyer called Rosalind Higgins, who was a very good sort of foil to John's thinking and sort of caused him to, rethink some of the things that he was pushing. But you have to go back to, Mary Parker Follett, for example, and that she was writing in the 20s and the 30s. If you're really thinking about somebody who had a long-term impact. But to be quite honest, unlike today, it was very much a sort of male-dominated profession by the time I got into it. I mean, sort of intellectual precursors. Well, long distance, there was a very unfashionable sociologist, at least unfashionable in his time, called Georg Simmel, who wrote a couple of really interesting sort of pioneering works, which have had a very long-term influence on the way in which people sort of think about conflict analysis. I think one book, I think originally he wrote in German. He was a German sociologist. I think quite neglected in his day because sociology tended to be, particularly at the sort of beginning of the century, the 20th century, the last century, to be very much affected by Max Weber and Durkheim, people like that. But he wrote a book called Conflict, and then he wrote another one called The Web of Group Affiliations, which in fact is a not written in this sense, but it certainly has implications for how do you actually tie together diverse society in a web that doesn't abolish conflict, but certainly dampens it down when it starts up. And I mean, his ideas were taken up in the 50s by Louis Koser, who again was another influential figure. So he was one, and we're talking about the 1900s now when he was writing. And then, and I'm blanking on the name.
Kurt Lewin?
Yes, Lewin's idea of, he wrote again in the 30s and 40s, but he was, his idea of field theory and his idea about, the favourite expression that we keep coming across is, the practical theorist. Very much gave voice to the idea that if the field was going to be any good, it had to have practical applications to it. It had to be practiced by people who knew theory, and that's a sort of thread which is still around today. So, and then the other sort of the difficulty of answering that question is, of course, as we were discussing earlier, people came into this discipline from very, very different backgrounds. So that if you were a political scientist or even an international relations specialist in the 50s and 60s, a whole sort of tradition of measurement and sort of comparative studies using statistical methods, the sort of work that David Singer took up. And it really goes back to Quincy Wright and the Chicago School. Wright did this, amazing, because it's a pre-computer study of wars, just sort of simply doing a survey of the number of wars that there had been up until, I think he started this in 1942, sort of fateful date. And certainly he really was, I don't think he'd ever sort of consider himself a conflict researcher, but I mean, basically there's a whole line of thinking that comes from Quincy Wright.
Chris, you mentioned David Singer, and of course he's known for a more mathematical approach to the field. That seems to be the people who do that, and then what is often called a softer research approach, or often called a lack of research approach to peace studies. Is that the major division in the field, or are there others?
Well, I don't think David would consider himself to be mathematical. I mean, I think he would be somebody who would consider himself statistical and quantitative. And I think that things are somewhat different. And my reason for saying that is because one of my colleagues at the old CEAC in London, Mike Nicholson, was a mathematician, was a mathematical economist, and he sort of used to get very hot under the collar when people introduced him as sort of somebody who did statistical work, because he didn't. He did mathematical modelling. I don't think the distinction between quantitative international conflict analysis or quantitative conflict analysis and non-quantitative, I think it's just one of the divisions in the field. There are very many sort of divisions and subdivisions, some of which have emerged recently, which I think are probably much more important than the distinction, and I sometimes think it's a false distinction between those who count and those who don't. I mean, it's certainly a difference, but you know, philosophically speaking, I think, you know, sticking numbers on things is one way of describing it, which is only slightly different from, you know, sticking, you know, qualitative labels on it. As, you know, I mean, I think, you know, far more important for me recently has been the sort of division in the field between those who are very roughly speaking positivist and empiricist, and those who are postmodern, and those who sort of see the world as a series of sort of narratives that one can apply linguistic analysis to, and those who sort of follow people like Foucault or Derrida, sort of arguing that you know, you construct the world by the way in which you describe it, and those, and I'm certainly one of the latter, who sort of say, you know, you don't construct the world, you may select from it, but the world's out there, and your business is to sort of understand how the world actually is put together, which God knows is difficult enough in and of itself. So I think there's a sort of a major division that has emerged over the last decade between, you know, what you could call the postmodern approach and the sort of old-fashioned, I suppose it's old-fashioned now, sort of an empiricist approach to the field. I mean, the other thing that's happened is, and again, I think this is a distinction which, you know, is interesting but not profound. You know, the sort of feminist gendered approach to understanding international conflict or conflict as it occurs within societies. You know, and again, you know, this is going to make me sound like an old fuddy-duddy, which I probably am. I don't think that there's that much difference between feminist approaches and you know, other non-feminist approaches. I mean, I think the major difference is what you focus on. You know, what are important questions, and that's not a particularly profound difference, it seems to me. I'm just trying to think. I mean, the other sort of difference, distinction, division, whatever you like to call it, that was sort of important in the 70s and 80s, but seems to have sort of died down a bit now, is the whole issue about objectivity. You know, is it possible to be objective about analysing, describing a conflict? And you know, I again, I think that people take up, you know, extreme position on this. I think that even if you look at some of the people who've written about this whole difficulty, like, you know, I'm trying to remember the guy's name, Feyerabend. You know, there are bits of the research process which can be objective, and there are bits that are entirely subjective. I mean, it's not one or the other. What you decide to pick up and look at is entirely up to you. The language that you use tends to be coloured by sort of subjective aspects, but ultimately, you know, somebody once wrote, and one of my sort of historian gurus, you know, if the evidence doesn't exist to prove your case, you can't actually say that the case is proved. You know, it depends upon what evidence you can muster.
So are the main divisions then essentially what you focused on, which is research-based, the way we analyze?
I think that's one of the divisions. I mean, I think that's. I mean, you can find divisions within the field, you know, however you look at it. There are sort of people who would, you know, argue that you shouldn't look for generalizations because everything is different. So you have to consider a particular case of conflict or a particular conflict system in and of itself. And then you've got others who sort of say, but you know, every individual is different, but nonetheless there are commonalities in looking at human individuals, which you can sort of treat them as a category. You know, I sometimes think these are distinctions without much of a difference in them.
The discussion about research methodology, how much does that have to do with the sometimes lack of recognition for the field in or outside academia?
Well, I mean, it certainly affected the field at the very beginning, and the sort of desire to be considered scientific, whatever scientific means. But to some extent, I think it depended upon where you came from. You know, the sort of methodology you used and the epistemology that you believed in, you know, to some extent depended upon whether you came from, you know, economics or psychology or, in my case, history. I mean, you know, if you really believed in the efficacy of game theory, which, you know, I don't, I think it's a sort of an interesting intellectual exercise, then that's what you did. You know, that you actually started off looking at, you know, sort of prisoner's dilemma, and then you sort of took it to, you know, looking at games of chicken. Robert Axelrod, I think, did some very interesting work about cooperation, you know, using game theory. But, you know, I sort of personally tended to think it was a sort of blind alley, but possibly that's because I'm not a mathematician. You know, Anatole Rappaport and Paul Smoker and people like that really sort of thought this was the way to strip down to the essentials the nature of a conflict system. You know, I come from a background in history, so, you know, my attitude towards looking at conflicts is you take case studies and compare them and see if anything sort of jumps out at you in terms of, well, that's interesting, that's something in common. If you're a psychologist, well, then, you know, the tendency is to try to do survey work, to be interested in foreign policy, opinion making, the impact that has on, you know, for example, hedging leaders in what they can do. You know, I think, you know, we started off talking about where do people come from, and I think where people come from affects their methodology.
We've been talking about research. Let's talk about theory for a second. People often describe the field as multidisciplinary, sometimes interdisciplinary. So we've borrowed concepts, theories, approaches from other disciplines. To what degree has that been helpful, defined the field, been an issue?
Well, I mean, I think this is one of the places where international relations has got an intellectual advantage over, you know, over peace and conflict studies, because if you know, ask somebody from an international relations background, you know, all right, what are your basic theories? They'll be able to tell you. You know, they'll be able to talk about, you know, if they're realists, they'll be able to talk about, you know, the theory of balance of power, the theory of the use of influence, and, you know. The problem with our borrowing from all over the place is that if you sort of use the word theory for somebody who's from the field, it means different things to them. It means, you know, theory about what? You know, and again, it sort of depends upon the background of the person you're talking to and the things that he's interested in at the moment. So if I'm interested in, you know, I think sometimes the theories that you use depend upon the questions that you're asking. If I'm asking a question, why is it so difficult for leaders involved in a protracted conflict to change course, then there's a whole body of theory which in fact comes originally from psychology, you know, to do with the whole issue of entrapment and the whole issue of you know, sort of commitment to a particular course of action and what does commitment mean. So you have a theory of commitment as well, which is also psychology. But then you get into political science and, you know, you start talking about interest group theory. So in a way, it's an advantage. You can pull in, you know, relevant theories to a particular problem. But it's a disadvantage if somebody says to you, okay, what's the theory of your field? Because the answer is anything that's useful to try to understand what's going on in this particular conflict.
Chris, there seemed to be a search in the field for some generic theory, and people often mention needs theory, Burton's needs theory in this regard. But I would say in the last 10 years or so, it's been relegated to what others would call middle range theory, to use a sociological term.
Well, you know, leaving the needs theory point aside for the moment, I think that's one of the ways in which the field has changed over the last, well, maybe 40 years. Because one of the things that needs to be recalled is the way in which the development of ideas about conflict and conflict resolution was accompanied in the early years by an interest in general systems theory. And that was very definitely and very consciously an attempt to develop an overarching theory of the behavior of systems, some of which had conflicts in them. Now, if you look at the authors who were writing in the Journal of Conflict Resolution in the early days, in the 50s and the 60s, and you also look at the General Systems Yearbook, which started to come out at more or less the same side, the overlap is just tremendous. I mean, you've got, Boulding is writing in both of them, Rappaport is writing in them, Dave Singer is writing in them, both of them. So is Karl Deutsch, and they're all of them in both of the venues in which they're working, searching for an overarching theory which will enable you to explain the behavior of complex interacting systems. And it's a very, very strong theme in the early decade of the development of the field. And then it sort of suddenly drops out. And in fact, I think one of the last people to write about it was John. In writing, he wrote a book called Systems, States, Diplomacy and Rules, which was an amazing attempt to sort of take some of the often very sort of hard sciencey kind of systems writing and to convert it into an understandable way of thinking about systems which involve human beings and human groups. I think beyond that point, the whole enterprise sort of starts to flow in different directions. So that you talk about human needs theory, or you could take up sort of Ted Gurr's ideas about relative deprivation. Now, relative deprivation is really a derivation of frustration aggression theory, which goes back to Dollard and Doob, indeed, in the 1940s. It's a theory of why conflicts start up. But then if you ask a question, well, why do they continue? Then I think there are another set of theories which sort of come into explaining the continuity of conflicts. Or if you're asking, why do they get worse? If you're asking, why do they escalate? Then I think you're into action-reaction theories, the kind of thing that Robert North and his colleagues were dealing with in the late 1960s, early 1970s. Or alternatively, if you want to look at why do they get worse, you can look in the early 1970s at a whole load of ideas that came out about crisis decision-making and groupthink, which incidentally is a buzzword at the moment about why the present administration in Washington, D.C. apparently is totally unable to grasp what is going on in Iraq. I don't think you're going to have an overarching theory of everything. I mean, I think the search for what one of my colleagues once described as what was the phrase he used? The theory of behavior, behavioral laws, which are like sort of general unifying theories that the physicists are looking for. I think that laws of social physics, I think, don't exist.
But what would you say was the biggest area of contribution of the field towards theory? It seems to me that so much of the energy of the field in terms of writing about theory has gone into third-party intervention. Would that be fair or not? And is that a development over time?
I think that's probably not completely inaccurate. And I think the reason is, you've got to remember that the field is sometimes called conflict analysis and resolution, and it goes back to the practical theories idea of Kurt Lewin, that the reason for engaging in this analysis is to find out ways of doing something about it, and therefore what we need is some kind of theory about intervention and about effective coping with the conflict. So, you can sort of argue that, all right, if you look at things like entrapment theory, the reason for sort of examining entrapment theory is to do something, third parties can go into a situation and, I'm not sure this is a word even, de-entrap those who are sort of caught into a sort of relationship out of which it's very, they can't see a way out. Mm-hmm. So it's the practicality, the hope of practicality, I think, of the field that leads to this concentration on, well, what can you as a third party do about it, and which is a different question from what can you as a protagonist do about it. So I don't think you're wrong, but I think there are reasons for that.
Mm-hmm. We've now been studying the peace and conflict studies field, as some people would call it, because we're still grasping for an overarching term that's inclusive of all the places where the field are being studied at the moment. But we now study peacemaking, peacekeeping, peace building, and we use terms such as conflict settlement, conflict resolution, conflict management. You've written about conflict transformation.
Critically.
So critically. So the question for me becomes, what does that tell us about the evolution of the field, on the one hand? And could that have been envisioned by people who started this 50 or more years ago?
I think that they would have hoped 50 years ago that there wouldn't have been this proliferation of labels and proliferation of lines of sort of separate lines of investigation and thought, because they really were, when the field started, they were trying to set up a unified body of knowledge which sort of built upon and reinforced the various parts of this corpus of knowledge. So I think they would probably have been disappointed. Mm-hmm. I think, though, that one shouldn't be surprised, because it seems to me that a lot of academic disciplines sort of follow this pattern where you start off with some sort of unifying principle, and the objective is to try to produce a coherent and unified body of knowledge. But then what seems to happen is that the thing expands and divides, and specializations creep in. Mm-hmm. And the field gets bigger and more complicated, and so you can't hope to understand all of it, and so you specialize. Mm-hmm. So that somebody now who is writing a doctoral dissertation will sort of focus in on the conflict prevention literature and ask, okay, how do we, what do we know about preventing conflicts crossing the threshold from simply being unpleasant to the other side to actually hurting them, to the violence threshold. And that's become, in and of itself, if one just sort of takes the literature on conflict prevention and the ideas that float around that, I mean, that's become in itself difficult to master, and it's become a sort of subfield. But I think that's true of sociology. It's certainly true of economics. Yeah. I mean, I think this is the inevitable concomitant of making something the subject of study. And I think in many ways it's a good thing. In some ways it's a bad thing, because you've written your PhD about conflict prevention, and somebody says, well, what about the psychology of being in conflict? Conflict psychology. Oh. So I think it's a sign of the maturing field of study.
Because you're funny, you're reading my mind, because my next question was, what do these different frameworks and labels say about the maturity of the field? Because it seems to me one can say it both ways. You framed it rather positively. as a breaking off into different parts, but can you also put it somewhat negatively in terms of trying to define itself?
Yes, I mean, and there's also the problem, which I think is not peculiar to our field, but is certainly a feature of it, that because it claims to be multidisciplinary, it's very difficult to, and it borrows ideas from hither, thither, and yon. Mm-hmm. It becomes very difficult to sort of say where the thing begins and ends. Mm-hmm. I've tried this exercise with the last few classes that I taught, which was to say, when I was teaching, the integration class at the end of the master's program, mm-hmm. one of the exercises we carried out, so I would say to the students, okay, I want you to do a map of the field. I want you to tell me what's in the field and where the field extends, mm-hmm. and I don't care, if your map is the same as my map. I would hope there would be some overlap, but you have to do a map of the field as it appears to you. Mm-hmm. And this is at the end of 2 years of, sort of
coursework,
attending the similar classes, and mm-hmm. The maps were very, very different. Mm-hmm. So it is a particular problem. No, it's a particularly acute problem in our field, I think, mm-hmm. Because of this borrowing from other disciplines. Mm-hmm. And people can sort of say, well, maybe that means that it's not a discipline. Maybe it's a focus of study. I mean, I've seen people sort of compare conflict analysis and resolution, or conflict and peace studies to development studies. Mm-hmm. Well, what's the theory of development studies? Well, partly it's political science, partly it's borrowed from economics, partly it's psychology, mm-hmm. Partly it's the amalgamation of all of these ideas and these disciplines.
Hence your reason for wanting to call it a field, but not necessarily a discipline.
Well, I think you get into less trouble if you call it a field, because a discipline implies that you've got a central organizing set of theories which interlock and mm-hmm. inform each other, and you've got a particularly distinctive methodology. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that by the nature of what we do and how we do it, that we've got that. But I'm not worried about that. I don't care. Mm-hmm.
I always wonder about the comparison between conflict resolution and the communication field, which also split off from other disciplines in the 70s. And depending on who you speak to, is also suffering from criticism in terms of is it really a distinct area of study?
Oh, I mean, there's I'm sure, a literature that I don't know, but I'm sure there is one about the way in which academic disciplines or fields of study get set up and respectabilized, if there is such a word as respectabilized. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is that a particular generation of respectabilized subjects will in turn look down on the next generation of mm-hmm. newcomers and say, but these are really not proper disciplines. And, so.
Is that not part of international relations criticism of conflict resolution?
Well, it is, and it's also part of the reason is that, of course, international relations got heavily criticized in its era for attempting to break off from, political science or politics or whatever, mm-hmm. and that was, when I was doing my international relations, it was slightly amusing in retrospect the way in which international relations scholars struggle like crazy to differentiate themselves from politics within the state. Ours had to be different. Mm-hmm. Ours was different because if it wasn't different, how did you justify having a separate department? Mm-hmm.
So how does one then look ultimately at the institutionalization of this field? I mean, over the last 50 years, since 57 onwards, more than 50 years now, actually 50 years.
50 years from 1957.
Correct.
It'll be interesting to see what happens next year to the Journal of Conflict Resolution.
Yes, and it's 50 years. But how does one look at maturity? What do you count? How do you define? There are serious journals. There are various departments of study across the world, master's and PhD programs, fewer PhDs. You can study the same thing through the disciplines. Conferences, there are associations. So is that how we define, frame the field, or are those the major changes over the last 50 years, or is that not the way one thinks about this? What are the markers?
Well, I think there are two answers to that. One is, yes, those are the markers. Those are the ways in which an academic discipline gets to be, or an academic field of study gets established. The other one is, the other marker is a sort of an intellectual marker, which is this producing some new knowledge? Is it producing some insights into things which puzzled us before, which I think is the important one. But of course, the sociology of academia being what it is, then those usually are a sign that a particular field of study or a particular discipline maybe has actually arrived. That it's not a particularly worthy way of actually sort of saying, yes, this is a new discipline and it is useful. But that seems to me to be, and I think that's happened with, over the last 50 years. I mean, if you think about the markers, it's happened more in certain places than others.
So what can we say about the development of the field in terms of practice?
Well, again, go back to what you said a few minutes ago about institutions that practice. And what one could say about that is there are now quite a large number of institutions, many of them sort of struggling, that are involved in the practice of resolving conflicts at different social levels. If you start off with family mediation centres, if you start off with FCMS and ACAS, the Advisory Conciliation and Arbitration Service in Britain, which are institutions devoted to the mitigation and resolution of conflicts in, basically labour management conflicts. Yeah, the practice has become institutionalised in two ways. One, it's sort of set up institutions whose main raison d'etre is, the analysis and resolution of conflicts in certain areas of society. And the second way is that it's actually sort of crept into organisations that are multifunctional and have adopted conflict resolution as sort of part of their job. If you actually look at the United Nations now, for example, and you will find that there are in almost all of the UN agencies, there are people and sections.
And even departments with such names.
And the same is true of many regional organisations, like the African Union, for example, has what they call a mechanism for conflict resolution. I'm not sure why they've chosen the word mechanism, but they have. And they've also got not formally affiliated organisations like IGAD or ECOWAS. The ECOWAS is quite strange because it's the Economic Commission of West African States, the Economic Commission, and yet a lot of what it does is in fact conflict resolution work. So the second way in which the sort of practice has become embedded in organisations which, if you go by their title, they should be doing something completely different.
Well, I think the same is also true of diplomacy, but on the other hand, there is a feeling among many in the field that in terms of the field's public policy relevance, that it's essentially failed.
Well, it's easy to say, well, what effect has it had on present policy towards Iraq, for example, or what's going on in Darfur. But on the other hand, you, I think, need to get away from the idea that success and failure is a sort of dichotomous, sort of situation. You either succeeded or you failed. I think that one talks about more properly what contribution have some of the ideas of conflict resolution made to the peace process in Northern Ireland, for example. Now, is that a success or a failure? I don't know. At least they have an agreement. At least they have stopped killing each other in large numbers. Have they actually learned to reconcile and live together in a relative level of civilized coexistence? Probably not. But I don't think you can. I don't think you should talk about success and failure, though inevitably people are going to. I think you have to sort of talk about what's been the impact.
But to not be polemic about the issue, but it's also been a characteristic of the field to attempt to be practical and applied, to be in some sense real world, and to affect conflict and to affect peace. So, asking the same question in a different way, how did we do?
B minus. But then, you sort of...
Is this a graduate school grade? Because that's failing.
No, it's a British grade. It's that you're not doing very well, but you could have done a C or a D or an F.
Okay.
I mean, go back years and years to the problem-solving workshop I was talking about with respect to Cyprus, which we did in the fall of '67, I think, something like that, when we were thinking we had this key to solve the whole thing. So we did this pioneering, it was a pioneering problem-solving workshop with representatives from the two sides. And was it a success or a failure? Well, of course it wasn't a success in the sense that we ended the conflict, we unified the island, the Greek and the Turkish Cypriot communities are living happily ever after. On the other hand, what happened as a result of that was, first of all, the level of tension between the Greek Cypriot and the Turkish Cypriot leaders went down. They started to move towards some formal negotiations between the two sets of leaders. The level of tension on the island at the local level went down. Both sides had been sort of blockading villages in their own areas, so that if you were a Turkish village in a Greek area, you had a Turkish flag flying over the center of the village, but you were then surrounded by Greeks who were blockading you. So, as one of the things that happened as a result of that workshop, the Greeks actually lifted some of the blockades. They let Turkish kids go to this local school. They let Turkish contractors import bricks into the village, and they didn't sort of say, well, of course, they're going to use these bricks to build blockhouses and things like that. Was that a success or a failure? Well, if you were in an overclaiming mood, which unfortunately we were for a considerable period of time, then of course it wasn't a success. But if you were in a reasonable mood where you were sort of claiming that this contributed towards moving the situation away from further violence, it was a success. And I think that's the way you have to approach it.
One of the ways in which we've defined the field is as a move away from the power paradigm. We could say that, we now have involvement by major governments in the world in ways that we didn't have before in post-government reconstruction, even in conflict prevention. So can the field take some Can it claim some success or some involvement in changing the language or the approach over 50 years or more?
It's very difficult to prove, isn't it? I mean, there's been a change. Is that because of academic conflict research? I don't know. I think it is. I think the change of language is good, even though a change of, I'm not a postmodernist, so I don't believe simply changing the label on something is a good thing. But, to trace it through is very, very difficult indeed. I mean, I think that, if this is success or part of success, the acceptance of ideas from practices from the field has certainly happened. I mean, I'm thinking now back again to where the whole thing started, and I remember efforts that we were making in the late 60s and the early 70s to get the British Foreign Office interested in this. And particularly in the late 60s, where one of the things that we were trying to do at the Centre for the Analysis of Conflict was to get the British government and the Foreign Office interested in trying to apply some of these ideas to the situation in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. And it was a complete brick wall, and they just weren't interested. They were the professionals. They'd been doing this for 300 years. Who the hell were these academics coming along and saying, we may have some ideas that could help you? In fact, there was one famous occasion, I think it must have been the very first couple of years in the 1970s, when the Foreign and Commonwealth Office sent a couple of representatives along to the British International Studies Association conference, which was an annual event, and more or less sort of said, why don't you stick to your academic teaching, mind your own business, leave us to get on with the thing. And that was the sort of attitude that was around almost right up until the time I came over to the States 20 years ago. And one of the nice things about coming out of the States is that the American State Department and the people from there were much, much more open to ideas from academia. They didn't sort of always adopt them. They may have been, just sort of patting our heads and saying thank you very much. But I think it went beyond that. So I saw, and I think the Foreign Commonwealth Office now is much better, because you could equally well turn around. The attitude was, well, if you're so clever, tell us which conflicts you resolved, or, well, you claim that you did this particular thing in this particular conflict and had beneficial results, but how do you know? You don't really know. Well, you could sort of turn around and say to them, well, how the hell do you know? And look at the monumental number of screw-ups that you perpetrated using traditional methods, having read Thucydides. So, I think a certain amount of humilitas on everybody's part is a good thing.
So, Chris, in retrospect, where has the field, as you see it, then overall fallen short? What has happened that's disappointed you?
Well, I think one of the things that I would have liked to have seen happen is a more systematic articulation of theory and practice.
Interlinked.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that has disappointed me I mean, on the one hand, it's sort of encouraged me like crazy that you know, the use of conflict resolution processes, very broadly considered, you know, has actually, you know, taken off exponentially. You know, that there are, you know, institutions, processes that have been taken on board almost wholesale. I mean, the whole business of every single United States government agency has now a department which is charged with the management of conflicts within that agency. There are now, you know, sort of institutions and organizations which, if you like, you could actually look at and say, well, this is pretty much like John Burton's Green Cross idea, you know. There are, you know, institutions that do environmental mediation. There are, you know, institutions that, like ALERT or Berghoff, which actually get involved in places like Sri Lanka or Liberia, you know, with whatever sort of level of success, whatever we mean by that. So in one sense, it's a very sort of exciting thing to see this happen. And yet, there's this sort of feeling that I get that a lot of them sort of either, terrible metaphors, they either fly by the seat of the pants, you know, sort of get involved and, you know, sort of do their best, or they have a sort of cookbook. You know, they go in and, you know, it's this sort of 8 steps to conflict resolution in a marital dispute or something like that. And I'd much, you know, it's sort of disappointing that people don't actually articulate as they're practicing why they're doing what they're doing, what they expect to happen as a result of doing X rather than Y, and what theory informs their choice of doing X rather than Y. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I think the field has in a way bifurcated into those who do practice and those that, you know, write about theory. And I mean, it sort of goes back to something that John Burton said years and years ago, which is in the early 80s, he sort of said, one of the things we ought to do when we get involved in a problem-solving exercise is every evening we sit down at the end of the day and write down what we did, but also why we did it, what we were hoping to, and what our sort of theoretical assumptions were in, you know, suggesting A to these people. And I think if I were to be the dictator of the field of conflict analysis and resolution, I would insist that that gets done. Mm-hmm. Not just, you know, every day, but, you know, a retrospective, you know, post-mortem, here's another sort of bad expression.
Practice translated back into theory.
Yes, that's right. You know, explain why you are practicing the way you are practicing. But of course, you know, it's awfully easy to say that. But I mean, if you're caught up in the maelstrom, which is, you know, running an intervention of any sort, it's difficult to do that. And that's why I used to sort of say to the people who were taking my course on problem solving and you know, the use of panels as mediators or panels as facilitators, part of your panel should be a historian for that event. Mm-hmm. And the historian's business should be to talk to people afterwards and say, well, why did you do that? Why did you why what was your, you know, and I'm using theory in a very broad sense now, which is, you know, what effects did you expect to get from that and why? And you know, because otherwise I think what you get is something that I've observed in various parts of the world, which is you get practitioners who have a particular technique which they apply, and if it works, that's fine. If it doesn't work, if it goes wrong, they really don't understand why it goes wrong.
So we really don't explain the utility of anything that we do enough, is what you're saying.
I don't think we do, and I don't think we even explain it to ourselves enough.
And does that translate into, again, the acceptability and maybe credibility of the field?
Well, I don't think it has that much of an effect on the acceptability and credibility of the field, except to those who sort of work in it from a theoretical point of view.
And has to get funded again.
Yeah, it's results what matter, and how we get to the results, is less of importance, it seems to me. And I think that, I mean, basically I'm an academic, so it's probably is less important to people who are running successful intervention operations.
So looking back, what surprised you, what disappointed you? You've sort of said what you would have liked to have seen, and what are you thrilled about?
What surprised me was the sheer growth of the field. I mean, I don't think we could ever have imagined in 1970 that we would be where we are now. I mean, with all the things that you've described, sort of programs, institutions, journals, conferences, etc., etc. I mean, it's just I'm totally baffled and amazed in a very practical sense that when I finished my own PhD, I sort of sat down and thought, well, what do I do now? And I thought, well, the field needs a textbook. And so I actually sat down in the early 1970s and started to write a textbook. And I mean, it wasn't all that easy, but on the other hand, I could read the main literature in the field, and I could synthesize it into some kind of a coherent whole. Now, if you're trying to do the same thing, it's almost impossible. You sort of talk about, the institutions and the journals. I mean, just sort of simply trying to keep up with reading the journals. I mean, when I was doing this in the early 70s, there were 2 journals that you had to read, and then there were the odd issues of particular journals, like the Journal of Social Issues that was on mediation, or conflict or something like that. That was it. Now you simply, you can't keep up with the journals that come out. There are sort of new journals coming every year virtually. And the size of the literature is scary. So I'm just, whether I'm pleased about it, I don't know. At the moment, I'm trying to actually read this stuff. I'm not particularly pleased. But I'm just amazed.
Is there a main disappointment? Other than the practice theory link or lack of it?
I think that, again, this is just a sort of initial impression that and it's almost inevitable that people who write in a particular sub-part of the field often seem to me to write in ignorance of what's going on in the other sub-parts of the field. I mean, and I think it's a concomitant of the thing just getting so big. But they're also, writing, it seems to me, in many cases, in ignorance of, the past intellectual development. And I frequently come across books or articles or something where I think, I've read this before somewhere. And I think there was this sort of, I remember this article that I read years ago in, Journal of Conflict Resolution, 1973 or something like this. And the one I'm reading now is being produced as a sort of a new breakthrough, and sometimes I think we spend a lot of our time reinventing the wheel, because we don't know where the wheels come from. And
you're referring specifically to academia now.
Well, I'm referring to academia, but I'm also referring to people who write practical handbooks for,
Oh.
you know, that you read these things and you think, hang on a minute, you know, Dudley Weeks was writing that 20 years ago or something like that.
All right.
Yeah.
My last two questions, I promise. One is, you wanted a historian, but what about futurists? If you could be your own futurist in terms of the field, where do you think it's going?
There are sort of two scenarios I have in mind, which is partly the positive one is because of all of these new young people coming into the field, it is going to take on a new lease of life and go off in interesting directions and pick up, you know, new lines of thought, and eventually it is going to be not just the language which is adopted by people who are responsible for making policy, but the actual theories and the concepts that are going to be used. That, you know, ideas, you know, relatively straightforward ideas like self-fulfilling prophecies are going to be understood much better in policy-making circles. You know, something that was you know, sort of accepted as standard practice, even in the time of you know, President Kennedy, is sort of incorporated as standard practice into policy making everywhere, which is, you know, you don't, you know, you have a, you know, in any decision-making group, you have somebody whose job it is to put counter-arguments, and you listen to him, which is something that seems to have dropped out. The malign scenario is that the whole thing gets co-opted, and independence is completely lost, and we end up becoming a. I'm trying to think of a phrase somebody used a while ago. You know, a handmaiden of the rich and powerful. Because it seems to me that if we do that, then our ability to resolve conflicts as opposed to settle them temporarily from the point of view of, you know, stability, law and order, is going to get lost. And I think we won't be able to say things like, you know, you're not going to be able to solve this without major restructuring. Mm-hmm. And it's going to cost you in the short run. Mm-hmm. You know, and if you're being paid to tell people what they want to hear, you can't say things like that. Mm-hmm. So that's my bad scenario.
Okay. I want to pull your leg before I ask the final question. So I noted that you didn't say transform, but resolve.
Well, you know, if you read that thing I wrote about transformation, you realise that to me, resolve means transformation.
Yes.
You know, that's why, you know, I think it's an unnecessary label, but hell, you know, we use it.
Okay. Chris, thank you very much for 3 hours of taping, but let me ask the final question then. Which you always enjoy asking people. What did we skip? Did we not ask you something? What topic did we not address? Was there one?
I think you could have asked me what attracts people to this field, and how's that changed?
Mm-hmm. And you would answer? In terms of what attracted them 50 years ago and over the time till now?
So now. Yeah, and how's that changed? I mean, I think what attracted, I mean, I think there's a very strong element then and now that it attracts people because it offers an opportunity to do something to make, you know, the world a better place, if you like. Mm-hmm. You know, there's that. But I think what attracted me, you know, in the 60s, and what attracted a lot of the people in the 50s was a tremendous sense of intellectual excitement and exhilaration, and I don't get that from people now. You know, I may be quite wrong in this. I'm just sort of, remember, it's 3 or 4 years now since I was a serious teacher, so I don't know about the present generation of students. But in a way, it's become a mature subject. It's something that universities teach and students learn. And I don't necessarily get the feeling that students now are thrilled by doing this. And I think we were at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it was because it was new and there were all sorts of ideas that were floating around and had never been tried out. I think our teachers were thrilled by it, and I don't get the same feeling of sort of intellectual pizzazz.